I don't think there's a plant more synonymous with winter than the good old broad bean. And this video is talking about when is the right time to harvest broad beans, because it's a question that actually comes up quite often, and if you get it wrong can give you differing results. So I'm going to pick a few, talk you through some options, and hopefully you can harvest the most amazing broad beans for what you want to do. So starting off, broad beans are quite often confused with normal beans in terms of when they are ready to be picked. And that's not an unrealistic confusion to have, because they're both beans, they're both shaped the same, so it's actually quite easy to get confused between the two. As an example, with beans, you don't want to see big knuckles on the beans because it means the beans have gone too far. Whereas with broad beans, you want to see big defined knuckles because that means the bean is fully developed. You can have the broad bean as a small little bean when it's immature, similar to a bean grown in summer. However, you don't eat broad beans in their more traditional form for the long bean itself, the whole pod. You actually have it for the individual bean. You cook those up, don't try and eat them raw, they don't taste nice. But once they're cooked up, they are so buttery, and it's really hard to describe the taste of well-cooked, yummy, buttery broad beans. So let me show you a few different options so you can see for yourself what they must look like, and hopefully you can be on your merry way to making some yummy broad beans. So before we even look at the individual pods, I just want to mention that it's quite important to know that there are different varieties of broad beans. These, for instance, I have little kids, so they've pulled all the labels out, so I don't know which one is which anymore. But this is a specific variety, and you can see these are really short and they're almost dwarf. But if you look at the pods, they're pretty much the size of my hand. They are huge. So they still have the same effect, however, they aren't tall, massive plants. Now if we look at these broad beans, you can see they are very erect, tall, big plants, which look very, very different to the previous batch. These need to be staked, but you can see even in the thickness in the stem, they're just completely different to the first batch. So before you start looking at pods, it's good to know what kind of variety you have so that you can know how to stake them and what to do in terms of supporting them when the big beans start growing. So let's look at the broad bean from its infancy through to final harvest. Broad bean is going to start off as a flower like this, and bees are going to be flying around pollinating the flowers and will then produce what you can see there is a little broad bean, and each of the flowers can produce broad bean. So if you look at a plant like this, there's a lot of flowers, and you can see already down here quite a few of these little ones have already been pollinated. If we look at this one, quite a few clusters of broad beans. Once they pollinate, it's going to give us a lot of broad beans. Then what you're going to find with your broad beans is that they're going to start getting a little bit bigger. They grow very erect and upright. You can see at the back, this one is full of broad beans, all pointing straight up. And as they get heavier and they start to mature, they start to droop and fall down. But in their younger age, they look very much like a bean, and at this age, you can actually harvest them and eat them in the pod like a bean, and they are super sweet and juicy. And then what we have are mature broad beans. And how do you know they're mature? Like I said, they have very defined knuckles on them. Behold this one, you can see the bumps. They're about 15 centimeters long, so they are quite long, but they have very clearly defined bumps, which are basically the individual beans. Now, a word of caution is you don't want the beans to go too far, because then they start becoming dry beans and they become very tough, and when cooked is not really a great option. And that leads me on to the next option you have, and that is to leave them on the plant to dry, and then you have dry broad beans. Those you can soak, quite a few recipes, but you can then soak them and have them as dried broad beans in a range of different recipes. Okay, so I'm going to cut a few and show you the difference in the bean between those that are ripe and ready to be picked and those that aren't. So first of all, I'm going to pick one that is ripe. And you can see it's about the size of my hand. Turn this way. Very defined sections where the beans are, and these are going to be nice and big and juicy. Then what we're going to do is we're going to pick one that is slightly underdeveloped. And you can see, compared to the previous one, it's a little bit shorter, it's a bit thinner, and the sections aren't as clearly defined throughout. If I put them side by side, you can clearly see a difference in the size, thickness, swelling between the two of them. These are only a couple of days difference. Broad beans mature pretty quickly, so you need to keep a close eye on them. But let me open it up and show you the difference. So now that we have the two opened side by side, with the shell, the pods opened, you can clearly see the difference. If we look at the difference in bean size, you can see why it's worth the wait. You still get the same amount of beans, so if a pod has 4, you're still going to get 4, but you're basically looking at almost double the size. So if you want to get more broad bean per plant, just wait until you can see those clearly defined knuckles and it's nice and swollen. This one's also picked at exactly the right time, because what you don't want is for there to be a dark line forming, which is basically an indicator that this bean is overripe. You can still have them at this age. There's nothing wrong with a little bean like this. Like I said, it's just a matter of how much you get for each of the plants that you plant. So there you have it, the beautiful broad bean explained from its infancy through to the final bean. I hope you now know how to identify a immature to a mature ready to pick bean. And what I'll do next is, when we cook it up, I'm going to show you some recipes to get the best out of the broad bean, because if you try and take a bite of a mature broad bean, you're probably going to think, why on earth am I growing this thing? Because it doesn't taste nice. However, if you have a little baby one, it will be juicy, but then it's not really growing a broad bean for what it's been going for. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. Every little bit helps. I'm getting distracted by the smell of this perennial basil, which is so yum. Please share this knowledge with your friends and peers. Anyone growing broad beans that might not be sure when the right time is to pick, show them this video, and hopefully they can pick them at the right time and enjoy what broad bean has to offer. Until next time, happy growing.